Good afternoon. Thank you for attending today's DC Family Business Alliance webinar, Effectively Managing Leadership Transitions in the Family Enterprise. I'm Natalie Birchfield, the Marketing Coordinator here at Beebe. In the next hour, our experts are going to share with you some practical and relevant information on how your family business can effectively manage leadership transitions through honest conversation. Before we get started, I wanted to cover some brief logistical items. If you have questions as we go along, please use the question function on your GoToWebinar toolbar that should be on the right side of your screen. At the conclusion of today's presentation, we will answer as many of your questions as we have time for. You can also use this toolbar to let us know about any technical difficulties you may be having, and we will try to correct those as soon as possible. Also, if you have colleagues who are unable to participate today, we will be posting the webinar on our website at www.bbcpa.com/webinar, and we hope to have that live in the next few days. Now, on to our presenters. Joining us today is Geoff Brown, a partner at Beebe and leader of the firm's Family Business Advisory Group. He has over 30 years of accounting experience and specializes in providing accounting and business services to family-owned enterprises. Also sharing insights today is David Gage of BMC Associates. An expert in business mediation and collaboration, David is a co-founder of BMC Associates, an organization that provides conflict prevention and conflict resolution services to business partners, family businesses, and others. Without any further remarks, I'll now turn the presentation over to Geoff.
Thank you, Natalie, very much. So, David, we're gonna have a fun little conversation today about managing transitions in the family enterprise and talking about honest conversations. And as I was thinking about this ahead of time, I thought that there were really two things primarily. Communication is one and change is the other that is involved in all of this. And if you think about both of those, all of us know that they're important and that we should try to do a great job with both of them, but we also all know that those are two things that most of us don't do very well. So
Right.
I think that kind of sets the stage a little bit for what we want to talk about today. And I think that as we go through some of the questions and answers, we'll see that they're about effective communication and they're also about effectively managing change. So anyhow, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask David some questions. He's going to respond. He might then ask me a question. I might ask another question, but we're just going to try to make this as conversational as we can. There are some slides on the screen that will basically relate to what we're going to be talking about. So why don't we get into it and see where we go?
Sounds good, Geoff.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit about the concept of having honest conversations in family business transitions. When the dynamic is not there, when it hasn't existed, what are the steps to kind of get that dynamic to be a part of the family business culture in that particular case?
Mm-hmm. Well, Geoff, I actually think that a lot of families pride themselves on their ability to communicate, but I suspect in reality that many of those families are communicating and communicating and communicating, but the kind of conversations we're talking about, as you call them, these honest conversations, I'm afraid that these conversations don't happen with the kind of regularity that some people might like to think they're happening. So, you know, I like that phrase, honest conversations, and I thought, well, are there dishonest conversations? Do families have dishonest? You know, I think possibly so, but in most instances, probably not. It's more likely that they're just not having much conversation, especially when it comes to sensitive topics, because we all have a way of putting those off. We would call, you could call the kind of conversations that we're going to discuss crucial conversations, which is also the title of a book that I saw recently. And the authors of that book talk about crucial conversations, that they occur when three things are present. One, you have people's opinions that may really differ, okay? And we always like to stay away from that. But in family business, you have so many things going on, both the family relationships and, of course, everything in the business. So it's very likely that people are going to have different opinions. So that's one piece. And then the stakes are high. In the conversations we're talking about, especially with family transitions, the stakes are very high. We're looking at questions and decisions that will affect people's finances and their careers, really their whole careers, and where they're going to work and their satisfaction with working and all of these very important issues. And in any situation like that, you have the third component, which is that things could get emotional. So families know that, especially as they put off these conversations for quite a while. They know that they could get very emotional. So those three pieces are present in these types of conversations around transitions in family businesses. So the question we have to ask is, okay, if families aren't used to this, well, what does it take to change that dynamic and create a healthy climate for having open dialogue? And there I think that in a family, you have to have somebody step up and sort of break the silence in a way and say, we need to talk about this. This is important. So that person becomes really a leader in a sense. And it could be anybody. It oftentimes is somebody in the next generation, not the parents, who would be the kind of natural leaders. And then to make these conversations happen, you probably have to change people's expectations about how the family communicates, when it communicates, what those conversations really look like, which gets to the next point, which is, I think, a really critical one, that it is necessary to set up and create a safe environment. Well, what do we mean by a safe environment? But it's one where essentially people can express their opinions, be treated with respect, and feel heard, and that it's okay. It's okay to have feelings. It's okay to have different opinions.
But everybody has room at the table.
And everybody has room at the table. Yeah. Which really, Geoff, is another question, like a basic question, like who's at the table?
Sure. Well, we don't. Yeah, I understand that, but I'm just thinking in terms of everybody feeling comfortable around that table, that they can say what they want, what they want, and express their thoughts, feelings, desires, freely without feeling that there's going to be some something, punishment or whatever. I think that's the right word. But.
So when we assist in those kinds of, help families with those kinds of conversations, what we're really trying to do with everybody who's there is create a spirit of collaboration, a spirit of we all may be sitting around the table physically, but metaphorically we're on the same side of the table. We're on the same page. We're looking for the same goals, the goal being to talk about things and have it work as best as possible for everyone.
And transitions come in so many different forms in family businesses. It can be ownership transitions, management transitions, governance transitions, a new product line. I mean, it can simply be a business transition as opposed to something that involves the family directly. It can be transitioning out of the family business. So there's a variety of ways that transition occur in a family business, and in each of those there needs to be communication, good communication, and all of those things. Transition is change, and we are really talking here again about change and how to affect change oftentimes, which I think is just a very, very difficult thing for people to grapple with. I really do. So, first steps, perhaps. when
Mm-hmm.
when you go into a circumstance where the conflict has reached that explosive stage, what are some of the first steps that you have to take in order to begin to turn things around?
Well, one of the first steps is to, as I alluded to a moment ago, is to figure out exactly who should be there at the table. And sometimes that's not always obvious. But we like, when dealing with these situations, we always like to have as our goal a set of agreements that all of the people participating will come to and agree to and actually put down on paper and sign. So that one of the first things is who's going to be there, and sometimes that includes spouses, because family members in the business may go home and talk to their spouses first things. There may be key employees sometimes who are involved who will really have a say over how an agreement that the family reaches will get carried out or won't get carried out. But the trick is to get everybody there and to understand what everybody's thinking. So you don't have hidden agendas, you have agendas that come out on the table. So one thing that we do is that we interview everybody, we meet with everybody together, and we also interview everybody separately. So when you have mediators involved, you have a distinct advantage in that you have somebody who hears all the different sides of the issues. So families can try to do that themselves, but the challenge there, Geoff, is that people may not feel comfortable saying everything, and they may need some coaching on how to say it. And in family businesses, you have those relationships with all of that baggage from all those early years of growing up together. And in our 40s and 50s, we may even find ourselves experiencing some of those same feelings all over again with our siblings and our parents. Mm-hmm. Now you have the jealousy, you have the competition, you have the old hurts. Now add to that story power, money, positions, titles, all of that, and you've got a pot that's really ready to boil over at any time.
Sure. One of the thoughts that I had as you were talking was how do you deal with transparency? I mean, certainly if you put a group around the table, you're expecting that anything goes to a certain degree in terms of the type of information that's there, the type of things you talk about. I'm presuming, and correct me if I'm presuming too much, but I'm sort of presuming that there is a certain level of transparency that needs to be there in order for it to be effective.
Well, I think you're right, Geoff. Without that level of transparency, it's hard to achieve the kind of understanding, mutual understanding that leads to resolution.
Right.
So what happens is before families really sit down and talk about these things, everybody has those hidden agendas. They aren't transparent. And the challenge is to get people feeling safe enough and to understand the issues well enough so that they will bring these things out. But the reality is that people don't always know what it is that's creating the tension. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's very interesting. And sometimes it's just a fear that if I bring this issue up, it will explode. So you were asking about what do you do if things get to that stage? Well, let's look at the next slide for a second. I like this slide because it demonstrates just how quickly things can go awry when you're dealing with sensitive issues in a family business. So let's see, Natalie, which button I'm going to do this? This is an interesting slide. Which one is it? That one. Okay, great. So in these situations, you've got everybody in the family around the table. Well, someone could just use a word to describe an issue, and that one word alone could set somebody else off. It could be the triggering event, as you can see up there on the slide. But it doesn't even have to be a word. It could be a tone, just a tone, a voice change. And that could be a triggering event for somebody. Or it could be just a look, just a frown. And what that triggering event does is it can just create a perception of hostility. I can see your face go like that, and I think, oh boy, there he is being critical again. And I perceive that as hostile. Well, what happens to me when I do that? I have a feeling reaction. Maybe annoyance, maybe hostility or anger, but I have that feeling reaction. Now, what's interesting is when I see the face or somebody hears the tone, they may experience it going straight to the emotion without ever noticing that perception of hostile intent. So one of the things we do is try to help people understand there actually is something that occurs in that flash before the emotional feeling. But now let's keep going a second, and this is what one of the things that we do with families is help them understand how this spiral of conflict works. So what happens when I start to have that feeling reaction to the trigger that I see? Well, very often it leads me to want to make some snide remark back or counterattack in some way. But what does that do? That just leads to you raising your voice or making more faces, which leads to me feeling you're even more hostile than I thought you were, which leads to more feelings, counterattacks, repetition, and it then ends up in an explosion.
So that's kind of a tough spot, isn't it?
It's a very tough spot.
It's fairly obvious. And sometimes you find yourself in the position of having to take that explosion and deal with it.
And deal with it, right. And if you're a family member, you're probably already tense before the first triggering event in some of these conversations. So having a third party who isn't exactly part of that mix makes it a lot easier to see it coming, to tolerate it when it does happen, and then step back and help people try to really understand it. So that's the key, understanding how you can, where you, in this spiral you can intercede and interject and get people to have a different reaction.
So obviously, and I think this is really obvious, as you see it begin to happen, you're starting to try to stem the spiral.
Right. And really, helping people to understand, especially over on the right side, because that's a part that people don't know about, really. They say, you did that and it made me mad. Actually, you didn't. It wasn't just that you did that and I got mad, but you did that, I interpreted it a certain way, and then I got mad.
So the interpretation may be incorrect.
It may be very incorrect. So there's a lot about communication skills that families can learn about to help them become more skillful in these conversations. This next slide has it real quickly. I'll show you one of the skills that we really enjoy teaching to people. It's got a funny name called the triple I statement. And it's this. Instead of just lashing out with a counterattack, I say to you, I observe your frown when I said what I did a moment ago, and I got ignored. Now, I'm not going to blame it on you, but I say, I observed this, and I started to feel really annoyed with that. And third, and I would request that if you don't like something I say, I would request that you tell me about it rather than give me just that frown. So this alone, this kind of triple I statement procedure is like one of the skills that you can teach people. And it takes some practice usually, but it's one of the skills you can teach people, and they become good at it, and it almost becomes a game to practice it, but very quickly they see that it changes the outcome of some difficult conversations when people do certain things that they're bound to do. But by reacting differently and using triple I statements, you don't have to go into that spiral.
Right. I would imagine that if your history has been that you don't use those statements, getting accustomed to doing it is not necessarily the easiest thing. And certainly some repetition and some training is a must.
Right. But the live training in the family discussions is really very exciting, and people get it about, wow, we could learn some new skills here. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can spend different amounts of time. Some families want to spend a day. Some families actually spend a couple days on just communication skills training, mm-hmm. so that they don't have to go through the agony of kind of unskilled conversations.
I'm curious about this. Is the training real time often with the family?
It is.
So you're in the room and they're in their conflict, and you're introducing and training and real time, and they're getting a real life example right then and there, which is really powerful.
Exactly. So rather than, some people set it up as, okay, first we're going to slow down in order to speed up. We're going to slow down, learn some communication skills, and then we're going to speed up and get into the issues and go through them faster because you won't get tripped up so much. We do a little bit of that, like for example, in the beginning of a conversation, and families can do this, set up some ground rules for themselves. And not only ground rules, but what can we do? I call them ground rules and meeting enhancers. So both the don'ts, like put your BlackBerry away, don't stare up at the ceiling when you're trying to, listen to people, but also meeting enhancers, which we call active listening. When somebody's talking, actually look at them, nod, ask them questions. There are a lot of great active listening skills, and those can become part of the meeting enhancers, a list of things people can do and not do to make their meetings go better.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great.
Geoff, if I might, there's another tool I might mention to illustrate how it is that in these conversations that families have, they don't always know what's going on, and there are good tools to help them figure it out. So, for example, in the book I wrote on partners, there's a chapter on personal values. And I tell the story of a family that called me up in a crisis. A son in the business. There were four kids in the business. I think 2 daughters and 2 sons, mm-hmm. and the parents. And they called up in crisis because one of the sons, who'd been in the business a couple of years, had just thrown his resignation letter onto the father's desk and said he was ready to take off for California the next day. And they called me in a real tizzy, and I talked to the son, and I talked him into staying around for at least 2 meetings. Mm-hmm. With the family. And in the first meeting, we heard from all of them about what had been going on in the business and understood, got a sense of what was going on. Between the meetings, we asked them to take something called a personal values test. And the results were fascinating. So we sat back down with them, showed them the results. They all shared their results, and looked at the profiles, basically profiles of 8 different values. And what was fascinating about it, and they stared and they stared and they looked at it, and suddenly every one of them realized that the son who had resigned and was ready to take off for California was different in one of his personal values. All of the other 5 had spiritual as one of their top 2 values. One of their top 2 was mm-hmm. spiritual for all of them. And this son's spiritual value was number 8. That was the absolute bottom. There were only 8 values. Mm-hmm. And that just meant they all just kind of gasped, and they all got it. That was at the heart of what was difficult for them. the values play out in different ways. I mean, there are different values, 8 of them. Things like power-seeking and individualistic and materialistic, and spiritual is one. So it's different values for different families, but oftentimes families, when they see that or when they study their styles, their personal styles, they're just some aha moments that can help them to break through to a new level of understanding, and then they can get on with the conversation. And that family was able to move on and say, you know what, we understand better now what was going on, and, you know, our best wishes to you, and if you feel ready to come back sometime, you're welcome back. So, you know, it's quite powerful what can happen with the right tools and understanding.
Right, right. Sure, that's really very interesting. I'm sure that there were so many unseen ways that the differences in values played out in that particular case that none of them had any idea of until they had an opportunity to really sit down and look at that.
Right.
So, it was a great ending. Might not have been the ending that was anticipated, but nevertheless a great ending because everybody got to a better place. He got to do what he wanted to do. They got to do what they wanted to do, and everybody ended up being kind of where they needed to be.
Yeah, and I pointed out to them that the expression of values like that can change over time. And his may have been in part in reaction to theirs. Today, his spiritual value may be back up there, but that's where it was then, and it was important for them to understand that was a piece of what was going on.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. That's a great story. So let's move on a little bit. You know, oftentimes the patriarch, matriarch is kind of used to being the boss, so to speak, and making the decisions, particularly in the first generation. And how do you get them to listen to the wants and needs of their children? Oftentimes that can be a very difficult thing, particularly if you take somebody who's really been in control of the business and in control of the family for a long period of time. How do you change that dynamic a little bit, perhaps?
It's such a great question, Jeff. You know, I would say on the one hand, it's a matter of timing, because you really cannot force people to do something they don't want. So if a father or mother running a business, starting a business, isn't ready to move over, isn't ready to step aside, that's a really tough issue. But children often find a way, and what I was describing a moment ago with that family is actually where the son turned in his resignation, is actually much more common than I think most people realize. Not to give people in the audience ideas, but 2 weeks ago, before I left on vacation, I had 2 calls from 2 different family businesses, both on the West Coast, so maybe something was going on in the West Coast. But in both cases, children in the family business had turned in resignations. So it got me to thinking about that. And I thought, you know, when all else fails and you need to be heard and a parent isn't really listening, maybe I'll get them to hear me.
Yes.
Turn in that letter.
So you take the drastic step.
Yes.
Or revolt in some way, or it's what happens in any family oftentimes, right? Not just a family with family businesses, right? In a family business. So it's probably more often than not it happens as a result of an event such as that. But I suppose there's also circumstances, there certainly are, I've seen them, where you know, the mother or father has the dream, and the children aren't really, you know, their dream isn't meshing. They may not even be in the family business They may have no desire to yet, and that's where their parents want them. And again, just another difficult place and a time for some honest conversation amongst all parties, it would seem to me, would be important then.
Most definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And the matriarch or patriarch in those situations may actually not realize that they're now, say, in their 70s, because this happens not infrequently.
Mm-hmm.
And their kids are in their 45, 50, who knows, and the matriarch or patriarch, maybe when they were 30, founded the business, and now you have kids who are in the business but have no, they have authority but not nearly as much.
Mm-hmm.
And they may really long for that kind of responsibility. And it helps to give people their identity. And I've heard sons and daughters in family businesses say, I don't make any decisions around here. All decisions are made by my father, mother. It's a tough one.
Yes, it is.
But it's absolutely a time for one of those honest conversations.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Well, let's move on to a couple of other questions. And this first one is something that I think is really difficult for a lot of families, and I'm not talking about death occurring or imminent death, but dealing with the fact that you're going to have a business owner who is going to pass on someday, and how do you plan for that? And what we've found is that many people put off the planning and put off the planning, and they have a hard time coming to terms with the whole idea of mortality and that it's going to occur. Anything there that's any great words of wisdom as to how they might deal with that? Because that's also a very conflictual, can be a very conflictual issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, this always reminds me of the adage, it's bad for the horse when the cowboy dies in the saddle. Some founders are very happy to explore retirement, and some fear that retirement is going to send them to their grave. Just the fact of retiring, just the fact of leaving the business. But who's really to say that a founder shouldn't enjoy running their business as long as they possibly can? The problem, I think, Geoff, is when the founder has welcomed, maybe prodded, their children into the business and then aren't giving them a chance during their kind of peak years.
Yeah.
So that, again, becomes the conversation that needs to happen. But I think without the children taking the lead there, it's probably not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
With those parents who just want to stay in and keep going, there's an aversion to having that conversation, and sometimes it takes a conversation first among the children to really get their courage up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To sit their parent down and say, okay, we need to talk.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure. I would imagine that the possibility of that conversation going well is, maybe not so great initially, but at least they've opened up the door,
Mm-hmm.
Which is the important thing there, and then they can come back to it again,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully, begin to make some progress there.
Right, and I think there too, Geoff, having somebody from the outside, being able to have private conversations with the parent and really explore privately and probably hear things that they wouldn't be so comfortable saying to the kids, at least not right away.
Mm-hmm. That just brings up another point, which I'll touch on for a minute, and that is the whole idea of having some advisors, whether it's a board of directors where you have some outside directors, or whether you've got a little advisory council or whatever you might have for the patriarch or the matriarch, for people that they turn to as advisors, and more likely than not, somebody there is going to kind of tell them they need to do certain things, and they're more apt to listen to them than they are their children, it would seem to me, in more cases than not.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, those don't exist, but that's one of the values of having those groups, because they really can help you with those things.
Right, and having people of courage on those.
Yes, exactly. Another important part. I want to touch on substance and alcohol abuse because certainly, if you look at any family, there is some there somewhere, and certainly in a family-owned enterprise, there may be even there's a greater likelihood just because of the stress and the pressure and all that. And I would imagine that you've had some experience where that's affected some transitions that you've been involved with. Any thoughts there?
Well, what happens sometimes is that families call up and they say, we're not sure if we need mediators or therapists. And more often than not, Jeff, I think they can benefit more from mediation. I do therapy with families, not usually family businesses, but we do mediation, obviously. Mediation has a lot of flexibility to deal with many, many issues. So I think if there are problems in the family business, those problems should be dealt with directly in a mediation context as opposed to a therapy context, which is more, let's go back and look at your relationship and what's going wrong here. However, with this issue that you're bringing up about alcohol and substance abuse, that's the exception. I would say that you want to respond in a situation like that with great honesty and transparency, and just make it clear to the family member, both the compassion and care that you feel, but also the clarity that they have to get help. They have to get help. And typically in these situations, you have to be in a program, some kind of program that's intensive and it's going to monitor you and it's going to help you and give you skills. And until you do that, your participation in the family business and making decisions and all of that is going to be compromised. It's going to be.
This might be a silly question, but how important to that individual is the support of the rest of the family?
Oh, I think it's huge. It's scary getting off drugs. It's scary going into a program. It's scary having to say, I've got this problem. And to have the closest people in your life right there saying, you can do it, we'll support you, but you have to do it. You have to do it. We're not going to let you off the hook.
Do they give them a sense that they're going to welcome them back with open arms right at the beginning, or how does that dynamic work sometimes?
I think it often is. Your position is safe here. You can come back when you take care of this problem, when you demonstrate that.
Yeah.
But too often people blink and allow the problem to go on and pretend that it's not creating the difficulties and risks in the family business.
I think it's inherent, though, when you think about it for a minute. It's inherent that it is creating difficulties. It's creating difficulties in the business and also in the family, too.
Right.
So it is critical to deal with that. Okay, so just a quick little, we're not going to get into any big case study thing here today, but let's just talk about an example where a father who has two sons in the business, both of them have been there for some period of time. They're well-educated, MBAs. They've been there for 10 years. They've both been working in different parts of the business. They're both very capable, and they both want to be the next CEO. That's one of the important pieces here, because sometimes you don't have that. And the father has to make a decision. Where does he start? What does he do with the two sons? How does he do it in such a way that he doesn't create a competition between the two? So that, and how does he do it such that the the person who is the CEO is a winner, and the one who's not a CEO is a winner also. And that's got to be a real tough nut.
Well, it's a very tough nut, and what you really want to avoid with your children is creating kind of that horse race situation where somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. So one of the issues here is how do you resolve the situation? And when you have conflicts like this, there are three basic methods, as we just put up there on the board. One is power, another rights, and another interest. So power in a situation like this, the father probably does have the power to say, okay, John is going to be the CEO, not Mike. That's one way of doing it. Another is looking at rights, and maybe there is something about what people have been told or promised, or some legal issue at times that speaks to who has the right to do what. And then there is the third one, which is what are people's interests? And that's where we find that it's most easy to resolve these kinds of situations, because if the father is just to say, well, I think it should be John. Why is that? Because he's most competent, he's brighter, he went to Harvard. It's so many landmines there, and so many ways that he can do in his relationship with the other son, and so many ways that he can do the relationship of the two sons, just really put it back a long way. So the trick is really to explore the interests and consider what might the father's interest be in a situation like that. And his interest could be that the business really continue. And we've seen cases where parents really think that if they were to have a certain son or daughter be there, the business might go downhill. So the father's interest might be in being bought out over a certain period of time. So the business has to perform at a certain level. The father might be interested in really having the sons work together, but he doesn't know any way other than deciding who's going to be the chief, so to speak. And then there are the son's interests, which oftentimes sons in family business, daughters will say, my first interest is in having my relationship stay intact. Another might be working together. Another might be, I want to be able to make decisions in the business. Another might be, well, I want the money that goes along with the CEO position and the title. So when this happens in a family business, and it happens pretty frequently, what we like to do is have the parent tell the kids that you guys have to have some serious conversations, because after we're long gone, you guys are going to be partners in some respects, in some way, even where there are situations where some own shares in the business but they don't work in the business, and some do work in the business. They're all going to be partners in some way. And I think really wise parents recognize that these kids have to be able to work out their issues. So one of the things we say is, why don't you suggest that your kids sit down and work this out and see if they can work it out. If they can't, then maybe you have a serious problem on your hands. But if they can, and it's to your liking, you have just saved yourself from being Solomon and trying to split the baby. Yeah. And you've maybe got them working and talking together in a way that is just head and shoulders above what it might have been if you continued to play that parent role with these probably 40, 50-year-old kids who are going to be running the business soon. So it's tantamount to doing what we call establishing a partnership charter, or for that next generation to decide how they're really going to relate to one another as partners.
Well, certainly not an easy thing to do in any of that. But those conversations between in this case, the sons, are really the crucial, the important conversations that have to occur.
Yes.
And can they get along, and can they work together, and how are they going to do it? And it really is up to them, isn't it?
It is
right down to it.
It is up to them. And the experience of working through those issues and in a charter and coming and documenting what they agreed to, being able to turn it over to the father and say, here's what we came up with, here's why, here's how we'd like to do this for years to come, how we'd like to work together. That is a real growth experience typically for siblings. They've been relating oftentimes one sibling to the parent, the other sibling to the parent, and it's a chance for them to shift and really begin working together as partners.
Makes a whole lot of sense. We're starting to get close to the 1 o'clock hour, and I want to encourage those who are listening to send in or type in any questions that they might have. We'd love to answer some questions. So if you haven't done so yet and you're interested in something, please send us a question and we'll do our best to answer it. And while we wait for all those questions, let's talk about something else here a little bit. And I alluded to this at the beginning, and that is that we as humans, we realize that communication is important, but in many instances we aren't able to do a very good job. I mean, that's just, I think, human nature almost, just because of who we are and what our makeup is and what we have going on inside of us when we're dealing with somebody, our feelings towards those people and their feelings towards us. So if we were to talk to somebody who is just beginning, their daughter or son has graduated from college and they want to bring them into the business, what words of wisdom could we impart to those folks that might help them begin to have the conversations then that they need, so that when they do get to the point where there is some significant transition, they've done it well, I guess. They've done the right things. They've communicated well. How can we get them to think in terms of this communication being important right at the start? Any ideas? I'm sure you have one or two.
I do have one or two, because I've seen families do it all different ways. There's one family right now that I'm working with that's kind of a model for this bringing in the next generation. Interestingly, I worked with the father and the son almost 15 years ago. Been around that long.
Yeah.
And it's kind of amazing to me that I helped the father and the son work out some issues and the transition from that first generation to the second. And now the son has 3 children, 2 finished college and are working, and one of them has just joined the family business, the oldest one. But this is where it gets very tricky, Geoff, in families when you're looking at doing it right and early on, because kids at this age have a lot of different ideas about what they want to do. So if you have 3 kids and you have a family business, it's very likely that 1 or 2 or maybe all 3 of them will really wonder whether they want to be in the business at all. So there's a timing issue and an age issue that still comes into play. So one of them may go into the family business first. Well, does that son or daughter have a leg up on the others? And will that leg up always be there? And will the others have a fair shake? So there's often a fair amount of sensitivity to, oh, well, our parents want you to be in the family business, but they don't talk to me about it. And sometimes that really surprises parents when it comes back to get them, and they hear that because that wasn't really their intention. So I think that one of the first challenges, Geoff, is to make sure that all of the kids understand that they have time to make a decision for themselves, that they're in charge of what they want to do, whether they want to go off and be artists or whether they want to be musicians or whether they want to plug away in the family business. And there will be time for them to decide that. But the positive thing that they can do is really say, you know, even if you don't think right now you want to be in it, let's all sit down and have this conversation and talk about what it would mean, what it would look like, what the opportunities are, how it would work.
Well, one of the things that you alluded to a little bit there is that part of communication is also listening. And if you're the parent, if you're the parent, listening to the kids is a really, really important piece of that initial beginning of the conversation. Right. So it isn't just the parents talking to the kids and telling them what they want. It's letting the kids have some room to also participate in some way, shape, or form, whether it's participate in the decision-making process or to be able to throw out. They need to feel comfortable that they can throw out their own ideas.
Yes.
And that there's space for that.
Right. And as parents, being very careful not to make too many assumptions about the individual children and either their ability to get along or that they can't or that they aren't interested.
Exactly. Do we have a question, Natalie? I think that there is one up there, so let's go to that. Okay. So the question that's been posed is, are long-time outside consultants close to the family good mediators, or can that backfire for everyone? And what do you think?
Well, that is a good question, and there's some different ways of looking at it. So long-time consultants to a family they tend to know the family fairly well. So in that way, people may feel that they trust that consultant. The problems that I see there are that oftentimes that consultant, very trusted consultant, may be more aligned with one person in the family, oftentimes the father or mother, than the others. So when push comes to shove and when the mediating and negotiating get difficult, there's a tendency for some people to feel like, oh, he's taking sides or she's taking sides with Dad. That's probably the biggest risk there.
Sure. No, I understand that, and certainly can see that. I guess maybe what you might want to do is consider that there might be a consultant for each. You know, who can they turn to that they can trust, and that just bringing somebody in and saying, this is the guy that I've worked with for 30 years, and he's going to come in and help us mediate this issue, or she's going to come in and help us mediate this issue, probably may not be the best idea. Right. So because it is fraught with that issue of who does he or she, who may he or she favor. Right. And there is that distinct possibility, and even that person might have the best of intention. Right. I would think, but if they've been, let's say that they've been working with the father or the mother for many years, it's hard for them to. I think it's just hard to be balanced. Right. And it's wonderful for each person to have their coach or advisor. But in terms of really resolving issues collaboratively, it gets tricky because then nobody really hears all of the pieces of the puzzle. And that's what you want, a neutral third party who can hear everybody. Yeah. Well, gee, that went fast. That went fast. That was kind of fun. It's a couple minutes before 1, and we're gonna kind of wind up here. David, thanks very, very much for coming over and doing this today. It was really, I thought, a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed it a lot. I hope all of our guests enjoyed it as well. If anybody needs any information, you can contact either David or myself. We are our phone numbers and email addresses are at the bottom of this one slide. I did want to point out one thing to everybody before I thank you. We do have another webinar coming up October 1st. And what it says here is we'll cover divorce, but just to expand on that a little bit, it's going to be how divorce affects a family business and what are some of the things that you might do to protect the family business in that circumstance. That certainly is loaded with all kinds of issues. So we're going to be doing that one on Tuesday, October 1st. Thanks again, everybody. And Natalie, do you have any closing comments that you need to make, or are we all set? Okay, great. Okay, thanks again, everybody, for attending. We really appreciate it. And if you need anything, contact either David or myself. Thank you.
Bye.